What's up, everybody? We weren't really planning on posting a video today since we're working on a few big projects, but something pretty crazy happened and it made us really think. Basically, Moist Critical, Charlie, otherwise known on YT as Penguin Z0, just found out about Tartaria and our channel was mentioned by someone while he was on stream.
Check out the conspiracy about Tartarian. Is this another reptilian thing? We'll do Tartarian truth. Oh, it's an entire channel. Wait, what is it? I just want the basics. Tartarian truth. The lost city, the lost civilization of Tartaria. This is the truth about Tartaria.
God, I wish he was going to say Atlantis, but he's going to say Tartaria. So here's the thing that you need to understand when you come across old maps. The terminology we use to...
Oh, don't debunk it. Jesus, you're defeating the whole purpose. I want to learn about it. Who did you say covered it? Oh, absolutely not, Andy. That's done by a professional. By Mind Unveiled. 52 minutes, Jesus Christ, I just want the cliff notes. Holy shit, the Tartarians have 6 arms. Auxiliary sub-defensive and proxy. The Irish Connection. Where can I just get like a quick, concise breakdown of the Tartarians? The US Constitution is from Tartaria. With a name like that, how can I not at least check this out?
Okay, so for this first part of the explanation, I'm just gonna dive right in. And some of you who may be new to the channel, specifically after watching Charlie's video, may not be used to this certain style, and may demand immediate evidence after hearing such far-out concepts. But if you're patient, after explaining the main premise of Tartaria and what we're even discussing, we can go into more detail and provide supporting arguments after the initial brief explanation. Tartaria is the biggest conspiracy, meaning it's not an officially approved narrative, yet in terms of the implications and magnitude of the topics covered and the cognitive dissonance associated with it is so great, it could be rightfully considered the largest conspiracy. Essentially, it all begins with all our taught history being, for the most part, a lie. So much so that it's mind-numbing to even fathom. Sure, there are likely some truths sprinkled in there. I'm not saying that everything that has happened has been faked, but more likely that it was set up to play out in a specific way. What Tartaria boils down to is fabricated histories in stolen cities. For example, what if I was to tell you that New York, Chicago, or any other major United States American city for that matter, was not built in the manner that they tell us, and was actually already here in America before the European settlers? Imagine that our cities are just recycled. That would be too crazy, right? What proof is there to support such a claim? In order to demonstrate this, we would just have to dive into each city's history. And that's kind of the purpose of our City Unveiled videos. Literally a 5-hour documentary on a city, but for this instance, we can do Tampa. And shout out to Old World, Florida. There are the Ybor tunnels, where the mainstream story is that these are prohibition tunnels, and you'll see the same exact story in many other cities. One of the main proofs for Tartaria, and don't worry, we'll explain that word in a bit, but a good argument is these underground tunnels which can be found in almost every downtown American city. Some are small and may have been built in a more recent time, but others are massive and do not line up with the ability and available technology at the time. For example, the Washington Street Tunnel under the Chicago River. There are also legends in Pensacola of underground tunnels, yet they have been suppressed from the history books and have been left to oral history because they don't line up with the official PR-approved narrative. Look at this. The Henry B. Plant Museum, otherwise known as the Tampa Bay Hotel. Now to explain this to you, one of the aspects of Tartaria is stolen buildings and lost history. What you'll find is that every city has old world buildings. All you have to do is really question their history. Because if I were to tell you that I'm doubtful that they built this in the way that they tell us, meaning that this could be a repurposed building or an old world structure, most people would look it up and you would be directed to a museum that is in control of the history of that building and you'll be given a story. Most of the time, you'll get a few construction photos, but it's fascinating to find out how poorly documented the construction process was during this time in the early 19th century. It's the same thing. You'll see these buildings that are already mostly done with scaffolding, barely any people, windows in the ground, and clear signs of photo manipulation, which that's an entire subject of its own. Also in Tampa, there's the Ponce de Leon Hotel, which was completely poured concrete, which was supposedly the first of its kind. Also, these hotels in Florida were fully stocked with electricity during a time when Florida really didn't have that much going on, or so we're told. Also, you can see the familiar Russian-style architecture. Ever wonder why it's called St. Petersburg, Florida? Well, it's not just Florida. You can see this in New York, San Francisco, Charleston, St. Louis, and many more. Many times, old world churches downtown have questionable histories as being built or moved several times. You can see these old world buildings everywhere, from Gilded Age mansions and government buildings to small shops downtown. Even colleges, prisons, hospitals, military bases are all structures that do not line up with the official narrative that we are told. Of course, we're talking about structures from the 17th century to the 19th century in America. There's also no proof that they were built in the fashion that they tell us other than state-approved documents, manipulated photos, and just complete lies. There's also the common theme that throughout the downtowns of America, you can see what is often called mud-flooded windows. Of course, the typical answer is that these are just basements, but that doesn't really make that much sense. Some of these downtown areas get extreme flooding. Why would you build like this, especially with cities near the bay? Many of these basements actually have underground windows and doors that lead to nowhere. So this would imply that the streets actually used to be a lower level and then they were raised. We know this was done for a fact in Atlanta with the viaducts. They completely covered up old Atlanta. This is another interesting theme. Basically, many of these downtown cities in America have underground cities, which make no sense. What, did they just do a bunch of extra work for nothing? Put windows and doors and streets down there for the heck of it? It's more likely that there are lower levels of the cities in America that have been built over. And there is indeed evidence that there are massive tunnel systems underneath the majority of American cities. This alone should be enough to question the construction of these cities, as they didn't even have proper waste management until after the 1900s. They were literally defecating in chamber pots in the 1850s. What you have is that there's this complete contradiction with the culture, technology, and population counts needed to create these cities and buildings on this magnitude and scale in such a short time frame. They were building structures in the US in just a few years that were taking hundreds of years back in Europe. Let's keep in mind what we're discussing. Many of the downtowns in America have old world buildings that do not have an in-depth historical record. Some buildings have no construction photos at all, yet they feel very out of place for the time period that they're said to be built in. Again, if you want proof, that takes time, and we would have to list the buildings one by one as we've done in other videos. Because, again, in some cases we're talking about buildings from 200 years ago. It's not too hard to manipulate information over multiple generations. If we look at what was being taught in public schools just 50 years ago versus what's being taught now, there's really very little consistency. Why is it so crazy to question that the buildings that were being built all across America, even the ones from the early 1900s in some cases, and one of the things that Charlie demanded for was evidence. Evidence. Well, I agree. Where is the evidence that they built these old world buildings? Construction photos? You'd be surprised to know how many fake photos were used during war. Actually, all wars. Civil wars, World War I and II both extensively used photo manipulations to reinforce the narratives being spread through newspapers and even radio. So I could just say I'm doubtful of those construction photos, in the same exact way that Moyse doubted the legitimacy of the 1540s map depicting castles in America. Yes, one is crayon, right? But it's quite clear that it's depicting castles in America in the 1540s and does not seem to be manipulated. Photos, yes, even construction photos, have been found to be complete fakes. There are other maps that show castles in America, including the early engravings of America depicting massive cities, but not only that, the 7 cities of Cibola from Joan Martinez's chart of 1578 is a map that depicts the 7 cities of Cibola, which were the mythical lands of gold that the Spanish believed to exist somewhere in the southwest of North America. Here is a depiction on the maps: massive castle-like fortified cities. If you'd ask me, I trust these ancient manuscripts more than these low-quality construction photos given to us by some of these museums. Don't believe it? Is this photo of a Mormon construction site real? Most would automatically assume, since it's an old photo, that equals proof. But that's not true. It's a complete fabrication. Look at the vanilla skies. No faces? Floating ladder? They would paint on historic photos. We have an entire video exposing this history of photo manipulation. This would imply that they did not actually build these temples in such a short time span. The Mormons were said to have created multiple massive temple churches with no modern technology, and yet they're photo manipulating photos. And on top of that, you know the Book of Mormon actually says there were advanced civilizations in America before Columbus, and that they actually had cities here in America. Now I know there's a bunch of really crazy stuff in there. It might not be proof, but it's strange that they even mention that. How can we trust the history of these old world buildings when our historical record on many of these buildings is scarce? And you want to know the main reason why? Because there's been a great fire in every major American city, and I don't think that was by accident. Some people say, oh, it was because of candles, or that they didn't have enough resources to carry the water and put out the fire or whatever. But you know, they say that the Chicago fire was started by a cow kicking over a lantern that ended up causing over $200 million in damages. Which makes no sense. They were supposedly building these brick buildings to be entirely fireproof, so why do we see so many fires in Chicago, New York, Detroit, San Francisco, all over America? And let's not forget the World Fairs, which we'll explain in a bit. But they didn't have insurance back then. You think they were just building these massive brick buildings and underground tunnels all across America just to go in and actively destroy it with fire? And not all of them were accidents. During the Civil War, in Columbia, South Carolina, the Union specifically set the city on fire to destroy the buildings and mills so that they couldn't be used by the South. They did this with many other cities as well, which makes no sense because shortly after the Union came into possession of those lands. Now we're diving deep into this material. We're talking brotherhoods and fabrications of an unimaginable degree, mental mind control and population resets. You don't think that small groups of people in power aren't going to treat Earth and its inhabitants like a game of Sims or Civilization? The reason why we're not privy to this information is that these cities in America were literally founded. That's why they say that in history with the founding of a building or city. They're telling you and then redefining the words so that it doesn't seem like what it is. The next aspect of this alternative history involves secret societies. Yeah, Freemasons, and I know that many think that's a joke, right? But we aren't approaching this from your typical Illuminati Christian perspective, or not even from a conspiracy point of view, trying to blame everything on the evil Freemasons or something. No. Instead, we're discussing secret societies from a historical perspective. Go look up Oddfellows, then go to your downtown and notice how every downtown has or has had an Oddfellow lodge. If Freemason, Oddfellow, and Catholic Knight societies had lodges in every American city, is that not suspicious and or at least worthy of a note in the history books? Yes, obviously, Freemasons and Oddfellows in the modern day are not the same thing that they were 100 years ago. Nowadays, if you go to a lodge, they're just a bunch of old people getting together and talking about life. But back in the day, they were doing all sorts of rituals. The Freemasons aren't the ones in control, neither are the Oddfellows. They are the mind-controlled orphans ruled by the Phoenician Venetian families. They are the top orphans of the club. Secret societies have always been prevalent in the Catholic Church. These Freemasons were called Knights, and they evolved into the modern groups that we know as Freemasons and what we know in the public today as the Illuminati. But the Freemasons are not the Illuminati or the people in control. These Catholic orphans in the 1700s that actually go back to earlier societies as the Rosicrucians and the Knights Templar, all of which were controlled by the church as pawns in the play of divide and conquer. So these Catholic orphans started their own society, the Oddfellows, to educate the orphan. And it's weird because they have these massive old world buildings with no construction photos that were also used as asylums and orphanages in many early American cities. They also contributed greatly to funding the schools and providing hospitals for a large amount of cities in America. These Oddfellows were just a bunch of odd fellows, and we're supposed to believe that they were just philanthropists giving all their money to the needy. That's the story they want you to believe. But this is when it gets dark, and this is all, according to the official story, factual. During the 1820 to 1950 period, there was an abundance of orphan trains that would move children from Europe all around the United States. They would do this to repopulate cities and use children for forced labor. This was going on before the 1800s, as before the Oddfellows there were the foundling hospitals, many of which have old world architecture and are quite massive. They were also used as sanitariums. Just to remind you, because yes, this does tie back to Tartaria, right now we're discussing orphans and brotherhoods because we're attempting to show you how history could easily be manipulated and or fabricated. We will come back to the buildings in just a moment. The Foundling Hospital logo clearly depicts Diana of Ephesus, the Queen Bee, and the Star of Ishtar. Now this is when we get into the importance of occult symbolism, another subject too in-depth to discuss in detail at the moment, but this is a clear reference to genetic cloning. We have an entire video on this subject that's pretty mind-blowing. But the ancients and medieval alchemists were well aware of creating humans from within a tube. This process is actually described in detail by Paracelsus. Many of the most enlightened minds of the Renaissance period believed it to be possible to create a fully formed human without the use of sex. Also, the Cabbage Patch Kids from the 1980s are not just some crazy doll hype where people would beat each other up in order to get one. No, this concept of babies being grown in cabbages has a much darker history. We have a massive collection of French postcards from the early 1900s to depict children being grown and sold in cabbage patches. And no, it's not just a friendly, funny postcard. There were hundreds of these, and some of them are real photos of babies, most likely orphans. They're showing us through symbols the process of repopulation. We have proof of this because the first reference to cabbage patches and growing humans is actually from an 1896 film, which was the first movie ever made, La Fée aux Choux, by the female director Alice Guy. Go watch that movie and tell me it's not disturbing the way she threw around those babies. Alice Guy said herself that she made this film to promote the 1896 incubators at the World's Fair in Paris. So these World Fairs were used for selling children. They were literally called hatcheries, and there's even a postcard from the 1900s that showed this. Were they growing children in incubators for the process of repopulation? It's described in the artwork clearly. So what you have is empty cities, buildings that were founded, and these buildings were then found by a group of cult orphans that we call Freemasons basically, and they founded these orphanages and asylums for repopulating these cities. Then they fed us our history and even the rituals of the holidays. Many other mind control games that we play as children, like Pin the Tail on the Donkey, where we were actually secretly initiated into their club. And this phenomena of Tartaria, lost buildings, and civilizations is not just with the US. This is actually the same thing in every European city as well. It's everywhere, and this gets into the idea that Tartaria was a global civilization because many of these old world buildings that you see in America resemble European architecture. It's not just in America, you can find this exact same style of government buildings all around the world. I'll explain that soon, but I wanted to start with America because Charlie was saying, why would anyone look into this, that people just want to make stuff up for no reason. But I don't think you could easily make this stuff up, to be honest. I also think he doesn't fully understand what we're discussing, but I really don't blame him. There's still a lot of work to be done. The interesting thing about these buildings is that it's actually shocking to find out how bad the historical record is when it comes to the creation of many of these old world buildings in America. Also, not to mention the amount of buildings that were lost or destroyed to fires. It's important to understand our history, and if it's true that some of these buildings in America were actually here before the so-called settlers, then what would that imply? Would that mean that there was an advanced culture in America and that it wasn't just primitive Native Americans when the Europeans arrived like we're told? Now, I know that people who may be new and from his channel may think, okay, where's the evidence? I mean, come on, where's the evidence? And it's this automatic source type thinking that's honestly really limiting. That's not to say it's bad to source and document things, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying most of the time, people are demanding some university approved mainstream sources, but when it comes to alternative history, many of the things we're discussing do not have an authorized answer, because we're questioning and challenging histories that were set hundreds of years ago. Many of our historical records for before the 1700s are just court documents that could have been easily altered or forged by the ruling elite. We're given a history, much of which could have been easily fabricated, and we're just talking letters, documents, photos. It is possible to fake. For example, if we're discussing the Civil War and I say that it's fake, it's all a lie, and you say, where's your evidence? Well, there is no official evidence. That doesn't mean anything. What is evidence? A history book from the university or the museums telling you the story? Is that evidence for you? Many times people walk right into a museum, learn the history, yet none of these Reddit-minded people who immediately demand evidence say anything to these museums. Some of them are using modern paintings, and the historical photos that they do show many times are photo manipulated. But what if I show you the clearly staged and photo manipulated photos of the Civil War? And also the fact that they had cameras during that time, but there's not one photo of the actual war? Would you not be questionable? I could go on listing all the Freemasons who were both on Union and Confederate sides. It was a stage, a brotherly act in which they were executing divide and conquer, and it's the same exact strategy today. Essentially, first you have these empty cities in America, and we could discuss more on why that is and what happened, but essentially, you have cities that were hijacked and emptied out. Now, I'm not saying this is proof, as I know how easily photos can be manipulated, but there are several photos from the 19th century showing cities being completely empty with no people. And no, it's not exposure issues. Look at the San Francisco panorama from 1860 in HD. Now, explain to me, why don't they have full-on HD photos for the construction process of some of these older architectures in other cities? Also, I don't think that these have been manipulated, as why would you photo manipulate a city to be empty? To make it look more presentable? To who? And that's a lot of work. Who would be asking a photographer to edit out all the people? And if we're willing to consider the idea that a photographer went in and masked out every single person, but are not willing to consider that construction photos can be faked, then I don't know what to tell you. It seems more logical to conclude that these photos have little to no manipulation, and many cities, including Chicago, were ghost cities in the early 1900s. Most of the time, photo manipulation was used to add people back into photos because they were so dull and depressing, they needed to give it the illusion of having more life. That may be too much of a leap for most people, but what you have to understand is the control of the media and information. Back then, pictures were the media, and there was and still is so much power in an image. This was well known back then. There's also power behind the narrative or history behind a place, building, or event. Why is it so crazy to assume that the propaganda and lies that we see in the modern day are in fact the result of a much deeper history that involves the inheriting of the treasures of the ancients? Or in other words, our city's infrastructures were already here. Many of the old world buildings in downtowns, or boom towns, are actually the remnants of old world cities that were not American, or at least built in the fashion they tell us. So yeah, all of American history is a huge fabrication. That's number one. Now if you want me to explain that, that takes time. I noticed that Charlie couldn't even imagine the concept of watching a 50-minute video, but then how are you going to say there's no evidence? There are definitely arguments to support the claim that American history has been heavily distorted and manipulated. With that said, that was the brief explanation, and understand that I'm attempting to compress a vast subject while at the same time accommodating short attention spans. I haven't even really got to the main definition of what Tartaria is. It seems that the best way to approach this was just to jump into it, because many have not even considered that American cities could have been hijacked cities, so I wanted to focus more on that rather than getting into the semantics on what exactly is Tartaria. But now, I can explain that in more detail, which should answer many of your questions of exactly what we were discussing. Okay, so we begin the detailed explanation by moving to terms. Our definition of Tartaria may differ from other researchers' definition of the term, so we need to first establish what are we talking about, because Charlie kept saying, oh, what are the Tartarians? Are they reptilians or underground apartment dwellers? Well, let's give the shortest definition possible. Tartaria is really just lost old world history. That's it. Obviously, there's more to it than just that. What is history? Can history be faked or tampered with? Many are willing to accept that the mainstream media can lie in the modern day. People still have issues trusting authority in recent times, but why is that same logic not applied to the history books? Let me just give you a couple things to consider before we give a definition. For example, with the World's Fairs. Now hold on, the story that we're given is that these architectures seen in these photos of the World's Fair in America during the early 1900s were all just built in a short 2 to 3 year span with no construction photos, and that they were all built from wooden pallets? Now really think about that for a second. Look at the Chicago's World's Fair. You see these embankments? And notice the level of detail on this architecture? Even if this was just wood, this would have been a massive feat. Yet, all we get for a historic record of the construction is some shoddy footage that actually comes from a movie about the World's Fair, and that's it. There wasn't just one World's Fair either, but several in the United States during the 1900s. So they just built these massive World's Fairs just to tear them down a couple years later? Many cities had these, even Louisville, Kentucky and Nashville, Tennessee. I mean, really look how massive some of these things are. They are entire cities. And so, this brings up several questions. Were these buildings truly built the way that we have been taught? Or were they already here? If you type in Tartaria, the basic gist of what they'll tell you is that Tartaria was a global lost civilization with advanced technology that appeared on old maps and was erased from history. As Charlie mentioned, a lot of the main points seem to be old maps, and yes, this may not be conclusive, especially with the maps that just say Tartary on it, but I do think a map from 1540 depicting castles in America, regardless if it's crayon or not, is quite suspicious regarding the history that they tell us in the founding of America. Also, Charlie kept equating Tartaria to Atlantis, which is fair, but to make the distinction clear, the idea of Tartaria is from a much more recent time. Meaning, when people are talking about Tartaria, they're actually talking about the 1500s to 1700s period, where a civilization that existed in a far more recent time was left out from the history books, specifically because it was hijacked. Where's the evidence? Where's the source? Well, now we're getting into alternative history and false timelines. Let's start with the evidence on how the whole story of Pompeii is a complete fabrication. There are a number of glaring inconsistencies in the academically approved narrative of the city's destruction, and many arguments that support that Pompeii is actually from the 1600s and not 2,000 years ago as the history books tell us. Some inconsistencies include the frescoes that were discovered there and dated to 79 AD actually resemble the techniques used by medieval painters, including the famous painting of the Three Graces found in the House of the Three Graces in Pompeii. Furthermore, Vesuvius can be seen on 16th century maps, showing that the volcano was active long after the traditional date of the eruption, and Pompeii was not in fact lost. There's a 1631 memorial plaque on the road to Naples that lists Pompeii and Herculaneum as the victims of the 1631 eruption of Vesuvius. There were surgical tools in Pompeii that were not supposed to exist during that time, yet they were found in Pompeii and are dated to 2,000 years ago, yet they resemble medieval surgical tools? Oh yeah, and how could there be pineapples in their frescoes if the pineapple wasn't introduced into Europe until 1493? Let's keep in mind that Pompeii was supposedly discovered in 1748. Again, we have an entire video breaking this down. The evidence is there, you just have to be willing to look. But okay, let's try to define Tartaria again. Tartaria is a term that became popular around the 2018 to 2020 period before it became quickly filtered by YT's algorithm. Tartaria is basically the next big conspiracy after FE. If you don't know anything about history, that may be the only way to explain it to you. It's a massive rabbit hole that questions all of our official history. The difference is Tartaria is alternative history and FE is alternative cosmology. It gets interesting because Charlie was trying to bunch all the conspiracies under one label, implying that Tartaria is just something people want to believe in. He even said that he could do the same thing and just say a bunch of nonsense and make it sound believable. I mean, go for it. But there's much more to this than you want to believe, and I don't blame anyone for not wanting to look into it. But claiming it's just made up is ironic since these people demand evidence without even watching an entire video. Which, like I said, is understandable since they do tend to run long, but without looking into it, it's not very impartial to deem it as nonsense. History, once you dive past all the filler, is filled with mistakes, plot holes, and complete fabrications, and it's hard not to notice those inconsistencies and not ask questions, even questions that might seem obvious or stupid at first. So to finalize the terms, let me give you our definition of Tartaria. Tartaria is the phenomena or category of alternative history that delves into the research of lost history and civilizations, hijacks and stolen buildings, magic, alchemy and cloning, antiquitech, cataclysms, mud floods, buried buildings, star forts and fortified cities, royal bloodlines and secret brotherhoods, asylums, orphans and oddfellows, underground tunnels and waste management, and suppressed Morris history. By labeling Tartaria as simply a civilization, we're missing out on many aspects of this mystery, because that's just one piece. It's not until you have all the pieces that a bigger picture starts to appear. There is evidence for each one of these subjects, but in order to understand Tartaria, we have to have that base. We're about to go down a rabbit hole of history that was not taught to us, so yes, that means there's going to be some things that you have to investigate for yourself, meaning there's no official answer. Keep that in mind, that this is just meant to be a summary, and I can only say so much on each subject. Okay, so let's start off with lost history and civilizations. So yeah, obviously you know about Atlantis, but there are other more recent cultures that were completely wiped and left out from the history books, being instead labeled as fantasy or mythology. One theory that was not started by us and actually has been discussed by several scholars since the 17th century is the Irish origins of civilization. And yeah, I get it, that might sound funny to people who have never heard it before, but there's actually a shocking amount of evidence to support that Gaelic and Irish Christianity is in fact the original church and it was just straight up hijacked by the Roman Catholic Church. How do you expect me to give you proof for that in such a short time? I mean, be reasonable. But it's within the etymology, the allegorical references of the Bible that were not meant to be taken literally, but allegorically. One of the best books on the subject is called Irish Wisdom Preserved in Bible and Pyramids by Conor McDarry, which covers in detail the process of hijacking a civilization. Sometimes this might be confusing to people new to this subject, and a typical response is that some people immediately visualize the modern day Irish people, which sure, many from Ireland with Rh negative bloodlines are connected to this, but what we're really discussing is the ancient land of Ireland and her peoples. Interestingly, this is where Atlantis connects. Remember, I'm explaining this to a Charlie-like mind, so that immediately sends alarm bells ringing when I say the word Atlantis. But what we're discussing is the progression of civilization. We are told of an east to west movement of civilization, that advanced societies began to rise in Sumeria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt 5,000 years ago, and then slowly migrated to the west over time. But with Tartaria, we're discussing how civilization progressed from west to east, meaning from Atlantis. Here's a quote from Donnelly. I'm not going to read it all, but yes, this is proof that people have been talking about what I just told you for over 200 years. And no, that doesn't mean that all the claims are true, but it does mean I'm not just pulling this out of nowhere. There is a foundation to all of these thoughts, some of which are too extensive to explain in a short video. The point is, after the deluge, or the flood, there were survivors who landed in Ireland and re-established civilization. Now let's get the whole Aryan thing out of the way, because many are automatically programmed to see that word in a certain light. These people were multicultural, and we know this because Aryan did not refer to race. In Sanskrit, it referred to one of honor, a wise man. This gets into the ancient history of Ireland, with the Tuatha De Danann and the Fomorians, who after a time of cataclysm had to settle and begin setting up new kingdoms. Now, there is proof to show this, but again, history is so mixed up because the people who set it into motion swapped locations, names, and dates to make it even more confusing. For example, the Phoenicians. This is another subject of Tartaria that we bring up a lot because it also causes a lot of confusion, but it was designed that way. The Phoenicians are the later Canaanites, but they are also the first civilization credited to creating an alphabet, mathematics, and advanced sea navigation. While many researchers have shown the connections between the ancient Phoenicians and the Celts, including the similarity between Gaelic and Semitic languages, mainstream history will say that this is because the Phoenicians settled in Ireland and that the Celts came from their culture. But the difference in art, culture, and oral legend in Ireland is unlike any other in the world, and some of the first megalithic structures were created in Ireland with astrological associations thousands of years before the pyramids. As presented in Irish Wisdom and Bible and Pyramids, the story is actually in reverse. The Phoenicians are the later Hebrews, those of the yew tree, or the corrupted version of the original spirituality. This is what we refer to as the Phoenician hijack, the process in which the Old Church, the Church of Iessa, or the early Phoenician or Phoenician Celtic Hibernian priesthood was destroyed, plagiarized, and then renamed, suppressed from history. These peoples were then hijacked and became the later Phoenicians, otherwise known as the Canaanites. They became the new church. This is the Holy Roman Empire. The proof is in the language, culture, oral histories, and the forgeries that are within the Bible, as presented by Conor McDarry. The facts presented in that book are undeniable and seen clearly with anyone who has a basic understanding of Irish history. So to explain that in a different way, after the fall of Atlantis, the survivors landed in ancient Ireland. This civilization began to mingle with a variety of other cultures, producing similar legends, traditions, and sciences that were spread across the world. They then made their way to the east and into the Indus Valley. Then the start of Mesopotamian cultures or Arya cultures such as Sumeria or Ardia, and then this continued into Tartaria or Asia. Essentially, in our research, we connect the Tartarians to the ancient Scythians. This is referenced by several 18th century historians, and the Scythians were the Celts who had traveled east. But again, they tell us the story in reverse. The term Tartar is actually a Gaelic term that is associated with the story of an Irish soldier far out east catching a Tartar, a thief. The reason we bring up Ireland is because there are many researchers who have covered the suppressed history of the ancient Celts and Druids. The Druids were literally the main enemy of the Roman Empire. They were described as savages and barbaric, yet the history that we receive on them come from the Roman historian Josephus himself. So, after Atlantis, the Church of Iessa was established in Ireland and expanded all the way to the Bering Strait, where they actually crossed over and established colonies on the northwest of America as depicted on old maps. The map that you're looking at is the Monte map from 1587. There's some really interesting things on this map, but you can see that there are 3 massive cities in Florida during this time and also elsewhere throughout the US that really shouldn't be on this map. There are also maps that show massive amounts of architecture all over Asia and Africa that are no longer there. And this does not align with the official narrative of that time period. Now, over time, many different nations and cultures were formed. It wasn't just the Irish, and each of these colonies were allowed to start up their own nations. What was originally a system of spiritual allegory with the intention of creating humans with a sense of morality, with a pursuit of working for a higher self, began to become abused by certain states, and this led to the creation of religion. The confusing part is that we have been fed false timelines since our birth. For example, Rome. Just as we mentioned some inconsistencies with Pompeii, there are many more to consider. One of the most popular points to bring up in the Tartaria community is the works of Flamenco. He's a scholar who has written on the subject of false chronologies and presents the idea that Rome may have added 1,000 years to the timeline in order to extend their power over history. This gets into one of the main chronologers that is responsible for our modern day timeline, Josephus Scaliger, or what we know as Scaligerian history. What's interesting is that the people responsible for our modern day chronology were actually religious fanatics attempting to condense all of human history into a 5,000 year time period. Many historical figures throughout time have argued for alternative versions of this chronology, including Isaac Newton. Flamenco's work is quite detailed, showing a number of inconsistencies in dates, historical figures, and dating of major events that have been altered to fit a specific narrative. This isn't conclusive or anything, but definitely interesting to mention. But not only was our calendar system altered in the creation of the Roman Church, but on top of that, they began using a J for a 1. This can be seen in many old plaques, coat of arms, and even buildings. But no one knows why they did this. It just seems to be some type of brotherhood reference to the phantom time hypothesis, that the Roman Church falsified the extent of her rule. Interestingly, J is the 4th least used letter in the modern English alphabet, yet it's said to have been created in the 16th century. But then why do so many biblical names start with a J? There are hundreds, including Jesus, James, Jeremiah, and it all comes from the Roman Bible. Why so many names with a J, and how many translations is that for a letter that was born in the 16th century in a book that was supposedly written 1,000 years prior? We bring this up because Flamenco specifically points out how the J was also used in dating documents, buildings, and art. It was a method in which they could falsify history through forgery and plagiarism. Again, we're not the ones to come up with this. There's mountains of research to go through on this subject of the Roman Catholic Church and forgery. You'll have to investigate that further if you're looking for your evidence, as we're dealing with history that has been handed to us by royal elites. For example, with Pliny the Younger and Pliny the Elder, and some other famous historians from this era who are also responsible for our perspective of history, well, the earliest traces of these documents come from the 15th century. The first Pliny epistles were published in Italy 1471. There's no real first copy of Pliny the Elder, but there are none prior to 1400s. History can be easily forged, especially when we're discussing a period in which the Roman Church still had power over all of Europe and then secretly moving her power into the Venetian families. Don't you think it's weird that the Romans had all this amazing technology and then somehow they just lost it? concrete, aqueducts, paved roads, realistic sculpture, indoor flush toilets, greenhouses, and advanced architecture that we really couldn't even do today with modern technology. Yet somehow this was just all forgotten and then we went through a dark age for 1500 years? Then out of nowhere, literally, we have a shocking amount of progression of art, music, and literature, all coming from around the 17th century. Before that, there are very few examples, and their dates are questionable. The point being is that there's a huge gap between the time of Rome, through the Dark Ages, to all of a sudden all our music, art, and literature appearing out of nowhere during the Renaissance period. That doesn't make sense, and you don't just start making music like Beethoven out of nowhere in the 17th century. Same thing for all these Renaissance artists coming out of Italy. Not only was history and buildings hijacked, but art, culture, and music as well. There is proof to show that many of these old European churches were not actually designed to be churches, and that some of these old world buildings were designed to take in energy from the atmosphere. Where is the proof? Well, there are books on this subject. It's called Atmospheric Electricity. And yes, they were investigating how to harness this energy far before that story that they tell us in school of Benjamin Franklin discovering the electrical nature of lightning. Like, they really played us for a joke. He flew a kite with a key on it. Guys, this is Freemasonic symbolism. Benjamin Franklin was literally at the highest rank of Masonry, and you can even see the compass integrated with this famous painting. These old world buildings had technologies that were capable of extracting electricity from the atmosphere. You can even see these at the top of steeples. This is typically seen to be just a compass, but they're more than just that. There are videos of old temples with this technology still active. These electrical charging centers were then converted into physical worship centers. Now that might be a little too far too fast, so let's slow down a bit and just speak facts. Throughout history, architecture has often been a target during times of war. Buildings would indeed be hijacked and repurposed to serve the needs of the conquering force. From ancient temples turned into churches to palaces converted into military barracks, the theft of architecture has had a huge impact on many societies. Almost all Catholic churches in history were built on old pagan temples. For example, several were supposedly converted into Christian churches during the 5th century AD. The Parthenon in Athens, the Temple of Jupiter in Rome, the Temple of Baal in Syria, the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, and there are many more, but all of these were converted into Christian churches, showing how old world buildings were repurposed for a new agenda. It demonstrates how theft of architecture has been a recurring theme throughout history, but not only that, another aspect is iconoclasm, which is the destruction of religious images and symbols. Iconoclasm is a form of religious violence that has been used throughout history to destroy the past. One example of this is with the Huguenots, who were a group of French Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Huguenots were known for their iconoclastic tendencies, which led to the destruction of many Catholic churches and religious artifacts. During the Wars of Religion in France, the Huguenots targeted Catholic churches, destroying statues, paintings, and other religious artifacts. This was done in an attempt to cleanse the churches of what they saw as idolatrous symbols and to make them more in line with Protestant beliefs. Now, let's get really deep for a second. Some of you may be thinking, well, okay, so what happened to these Tartarians or ancient Irish civilizations? Obviously, there's no direct source for that question, so we're going to have to do some exploring. The next area we must explain when it comes to Tartaria is cataclysm. For some reason, this isn't something that gets a lot of attention in history class, but the medieval writers were constantly talking about cataclysms. And we're not talking about the flood of Atlantis, we're discussing cataclysms of fire and of earth, as described by Plato's Timaeus. Timaeus is Plato's most prized work, where he details the cycle and resets of multiple past civilizations, not just Atlantis. And knowing what we know now, it's possible that the work of Timaeus is actually from the 16th century and not from 2,000 years ago, which would bring an entirely different context to the story. All we know is that there have been several recent cataclysms, including several that are associated with comets in America. We have a few videos discussing this, even evidence to support that the Great Lakes in America were actually created in the 1600s. These cataclysms are important because it shows the civilization has gone through several resets. The most recent one that has had the most impact seems to be the War of 1812, which again not only had one of the largest earthquakes in history, but there was an 1812 comet as well. There's evidence to suggest that there was massive flooding all around the world in recent times, including mud floods. Many buildings and structures around the world that we see in the modern day, and even in downtown areas, seem to be in fact buried buildings, obscured by layers of mud and sediment. The idea of mud flood is that there was a series of floods that swept across the old world, burying entire towns and cities throughout Europe and America beneath layers of mud and debris. Now, to most people hearing that for the first time, that might sound ridiculous, but there is evidence to suggest that it may in fact be true. One strong argument is that in archaeology, there are ancient sites called tells, which is a mound consisting of accumulated debris and natural sediment. They are buried cities. Another argument, as we mentioned, is that many old world buildings, particularly those from the 17th to 19th centuries, have basements that extend far below the ground. These basements are often not visible from the surface, and yet they contain windows and doors that lead to nowhere. Also, let's not forget the countless accounts from ancient texts and legends that describe massive floods and cataclysmic events that swept across the old world. A manuscript called the Book of Miracles describes several cataclysms in detail, but it makes a very interesting point. They claim that these were not natural disasters, but disasters that were the work of a higher power, which goes to show that they were consciously created to some degree. Now, what you're about to hear is controversial, but there's always been a fascination with the Ark of the Covenant. These Canaanites had control of a very powerful weapon that is beyond the technology that we have today. It is said to be a weapon of mass destruction, and no, I don't think it has anything to do with aliens. If you ask me, it would seem that we're dealing with some black magic that involves the conscious creation of cataclysms. That might be a little too far in the deep side of the pool, so I'll come back a bit, but magic does come to play here. And no, we're not talking sorcery and fantasy magic. We're talking about how every royal court had an astrologer and master alchemist. They were not only trying to make predictions, but to force them to manifest through mass rituals. Obviously that's conjecture, but it's important to consider that it may have been possible through ritual or some type of unknown technology to influence the atmosphere or conditions in which produce certain cataclysmic conditions. The New Madrid earthquakes during the 1812 period were the most intense recorded in American history. The extent of its damage is still not really known, yet there are clear indications in the modern day, and even in our scarce photographic record, we see photos in the late 1800s of them digging cities out of the mud. Why were all the streets made out of dirt and horse poop when the Romans had paved streets? Why was there no proper waste management in the United States until after the 1900s? Well, it's because they found these cities and had no idea how to operate them. They came in and started putting waste and water into a single pipe, many of which were old water tunnels for drainage. And what happened? Great stinks. Massive cholera epidemics all over the United States, all the way into the late 19th century? Doesn't add up how they were building all this grand architecture from Civil War forts, otherwise known as star forts, all the way to massive mansions from the Gilded Age. Yet, they had no bathrooms or plumbing systems? This gets into some other deep subjects such as the diet and spiritual capabilities of these prior inhabitants, but much of that information will be too much for most of you new to the subject. These star forts or Civil War forts, have you been to one? One of the most massive one is in Pensacola on a beach. Good luck explaining how they went about building that on soft sand in the early 1800s. But forgetting that, they had these all over the East Coast and even in San Francisco. Yet the explanation is that they were built during the Civil War era to protect America's coast? But this isn't true, as many of these forts are actually based on older forts supposedly, and there were massive forts being constructed by the Spanish and French when they first arrived as well. Although, the museums like to make you think that they were just building wooden presidios. The entire story of the colonization of America is a fabrication. We're told the story that these countries such as Spain, France, and England were all fighting each other in the pursuit of the colonization of America. Yeah, but who were they working for? Who funded these projects? Well, they were all under control of the Holy Roman Church. The proof is in the coat of arms. What do you think a coat of arms is? Type in the Triumphal Arch of Maximilian, which is a 16th century woodcut showing you all the Roman-controlled minions. This is one huge royal bloodline operation, and that is the history that we receive. These Civil War forts or bastions or star forts were already in America, and every major European ancient city was once a fortified city. That's the secret of Amsterdam and Paris. They are massive star forts. Star forts contain multiple layers, including an underground tunnel system. You can see many of these European star forts on many 16th century maps, showing that they weren't just bastions used for wars, but they were also used for the creation of massive cities. One of the most immediate questions from someone new to the subject is, well, why would they do this, and who are they? Why lie about everything? What's the need to want to cover up history? Well, because these occult societies were in control by royalty and the church. And this church was a hijacked church that belonged to a previous civilization. But not only that, the control of information is necessary in the resetting of a society. This is constantly referenced in Hollywood movies as well, where the elites of a society keep the hidden history away from the people for the greater good. That's what we're discussing. Royal elite bloodlines, who funded occult Protestant thinkers to create a brand new Atlantis, as conceived by Francis Bacon, a scientifically ruled society that would exist for eternity and never fall again. So why would this be suppressed? Well, if we all knew that we were a reset population, and that there were advanced civilizations before us with superior technology that did not charge for energy resources, then that would make us much more difficult to control. As we mentioned, that some of the old world buildings seem to be made with the purpose of extracting energy from the atmosphere. But on top of that, they had dirigibles that could travel on essentially free power, if not cheap clean energy. This would also transport mass amounts of goods, possibly even for moving buildings. Why do you think there was a cameraman right there ready to capture the destruction of the Hindenburg? It was to erase the old model based on clean energy and to implement a new system of dirty oil energy. That's not the only reason. Like we said, this all started with the corrupted cult of Baal, the religion of the Canaanites. One of the things that Charlie said is that people just like to believe the most unhinged things for no real reason and they don't even gain anything out of it. And of course he's right that people do tend to think conspiracies when it comes to large amounts of power and money, but there is a reason for that. But that's not the only reason we've come to the conclusions that we've come to. What this comes down to is attempting to understand our realm. But not only that, questioning the status quo that was literally forced down our throats. What do we get out of it? How about just understanding our past and just being more curious? I mean, reality is far stranger than fiction, and we're taught a boring, dull version of history in the school system, much of which leads people to not really care about life. He also said that he didn't think the elite weirdos really cared about religion. In a way he's right, but he's also ignoring that they are inversionists and occultists. The elites care about religion in the way that they like to make a mockery of it, and again, we're not religious or Christians. Sure, there's a lot of satanic hype going on right now, and probably for a good reason, because people are sort of recognizing unsettling patterns within these certain symbols. We're taught that man is at its pinnacle today, as if we reached our max point in evolution. However, I think it's quite blatant that really isn't the case when you see the level of awareness in the media and our culture today. it's arguably more accurate to say that we have de-evolved as a species. But in a larger context compared to the civilizations of the ancients, a massive amount of knowledge and intelligence has been lost compared to what was once achieved in the past. Don't you think it's strange that we've just lost the ability to build these structures? I mean, compare an old world city to the modern day. It's shocking how much we lost, and our new construction methods of modernism are not designed to last. It's not to say that we don't have the technology, but that you would think there would be an evolution from the advanced architectures and early styles in America, but instead all we get is a bunch of cheap box buildings. If you want to tell Charlie to check this out, that'd be cool, although I don't really think he's gonna watch the whole thing. I mean, I'd be surprised if he did. But I don't even expect us to prove anything. I mean, we don't claim to have the answers. I just see this as an opportunity to get this information out to more people so that we can continue to ask questions, even questions that might seem dumb or irrelevant. I don't expect Charlie to respond, but if he did, we would just try to learn from it and improve from it. He did say he wanted an explanation on Tartaria, and he specifically mentioned our channel. So it was kind of tough because I understand he has a large audience that probably is never going to take the time to look into some of these things. But at the same time, there is a chance to get this information out to more people and assist others in questioning history, and so I think it's worth it. Regardless, thanks for listening, guys. We got some new big projects coming soon, and in the meantime, all we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?